Well, welcome everybody to today's lesson, which is lesson number 4. We are dealing with the genre of poetry, and we will just get into this. I want to thank you guys for the messages that you've been, even just in the comment section. Let me know, by the way, how these are impacting your lives. Some people have sent me personal messages, and some in the comment section saying that it's of great use for them, and they're thanking me for these lessons. Let me just say something that's very important. These lessons are not meant to be kind of exhaustive treatments of any one of these specific genres, okay? These are meant to be, from my perspective, introductions to people understanding the very basics of the genres of the Bible. In the description box, you will see 2 books. One of them is this book, which is a Introduction to Biblical Interpretation by Klein, Blomberg, and Hubbard. This book is intended on being a very thorough and detailed treatment of all the genres, subgenres, right? So if you're looking at poetry, you're going into, for example, different kinds of poetry, and then they treat those things as to what you should expect in them. And the other book is How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. There is another, a sequel to that book, How to Read each book of the Bible for all it's worth. And both of those are really good, but I just have the first one of those in the description box linked, and I highly recommend you read that book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And then if you want to really study biblical genres, invest time and effort into it and money, get this book. This is a graduate level book. Again, it's a textbook, but it will help you quite a bit. My lessons are an overview of how these things are supposed to be. My lessons are an overview on how to at least distinguish between what these different genres are, and ideally, I'm thinking of someone who has just recently started reading the Bible, or is interested in the Bible, who's not a believer, or is a believer who hasn't really invested time and has just been told, read your Bible. And then they never were told like what to read, how to read it, and any number of those things that could potentially come with that. This is for that person, if those are your interests. So let me just jump into it, and we'll go from there. As always, these get cut out and posted as separate videos. So if you're watching the replay of this, you're watching the video, the shorter version of this without the Q&As. Thank you, as always, again. I hope that this benefits you quite a bit. Okay. So this is lesson 4. If you haven't seen the other lessons, the other videos, feel free to watch this and then go back and watch those things, because they can be standalone lessons, so they're not necessarily connected to each other like that. Okay? Okay, here's the purpose in regards to poetry specifically. I explained what the purpose of these lessons are, what the purpose of this playlist is on YouTube, but specifically on this. The student or the students ought to be able to recognize that there are different kinds of poetry. The reason why I'm sharing this, excuse me, the reason why I'm sharing what my purpose is in teaching this is that when you go, oh man, like he didn't go in detail the way I was expecting him to, which I'm not going to do, is essentially the overview idea, right? So you ought to recognize that there are different kinds of poetry found within the Bible. So even when we say poetry, we say, oh, the Psalms are poetry. That means a bunch of stuff, different kinds of poetry. And each one of those things is going to have kind of your interpretive approach to it, genre specific to it, okay? these poems should be recognized within their context and interpreted as such. So if you're reading, say, a royal psalm for a coronation service, that ought to be read differently than, say, a psalm of complaint. So as long as you recognize it. I should also say that I think poetry in the Bible constitutes about 33% of the Bible. Or let's just say 30%. Now, there are books that aren't in the genre of poetry that have poetry in them. We're going to look at a section of one of these books later, towards the end of this. And that's just, again, look at the amount that you're covering when you understand poetry. Narrative is about 40%. So if you understand narrative and poetry, you're covering about 70% of the Bible. Like, you'll have the ability to understand about 70% of the Bible. So just those two things, guys. Now, again, it goes into more detail, but that's going to give you a lot of tools to work with. Okay. Okay, so specifically the book of Psalms. Again, like I said, the poetry in the Bible is way beyond the book of Psalms. But the book of Psalms is a book of poetry. And so it's going to take quite a bit of our attention. And then if you know what's happening in the book of Psalms and interpret different poems properly, the different songs properly, then you're going to be able to apply those same principles into other aspects or other books, and then see clearly there's a genre-specific kind of understanding of it. So when people tell you stuff like, do you take the Bible literally, then you have a proper response. Like, well, it depends what you're talking about, right? Are we required, considering if you can structurally break down, say, the book of Job, and then very clearly structurally it looks like poetry, what we would put in the category of wisdom poetry, then your response to that is, well, hang on, both of these things are highly symbolic genres, both poetry and wisdom. And so should I take it literally? And maybe yes. Maybe it's taken and put into a kind of a package of within a narrative about a person's life, but quite a bit of it has to do with poetry. And so it gets a bit more complicated, and we don't want to be simplistic thinkers about this stuff, right? Too often people are simplistic thinkers of these things, and we don't want to be like that. And even if you are a non-theist, even if you are not a Christian, when you accuse Christians of certain things, just do it fairly, is what my response is, and then just don't sound like you're an uninformed individual. And if you're a Christian, know what you're talking about when you say things like, I take the Bible literally, because nobody really takes the Bible literally. Again, my go-to line there is, I take the Bible literarily, within it, meaning within its literary context and genre. And that's the way it ought to be read. So the book of Psalms specifically itself is separated into 5 different books. Or you can say 5 different sections, right? First and foremost, we get book 1, which is Psalm 1 to 41. Book 2, which is Psalm 42 to 72. Book 3, that's Psalm 73 to 89. Book 4, Psalm 90 to 106, book 5, Psalm 107 to 150. So the entire book of Psalms has within it a certain kind of separation. So here are the way that some of these are broken down in regards to genre. We have laments. Okay. Lament psalms are the largest group of psalms that we have. And then within that, we have 2 different kinds of laments. We have individual laments and then corporate laments, right? So a lament is to cry, right? Like, there's an entire book of the Bible dedicated to lamenting. It's called the Book of Lamentations, and it's specifically written by Jeremiah. It has to do with what's going on in Israel during the time of Jeremiah, and it's a lament over the condition of Israel, essentially. And the judgment that's come upon them. So the largest section, this is why This is why a lot of people are drawn to read the book of Psalms, because they, especially when they're going through difficult times in their lives, is because they feel a certain kind of connection. Well, yeah, the largest portion has to do with people lamenting, crying, weeping before the Lord. And so Psalm 1, one individual laments, those are personal sort of stuff to you, like, where are you? My God, why have you forsaken me? Kind of stuff. And then corporate laments has to do with the corporate community coming together, and those were written for those purposes of coming before the Lord as a community, lamenting before Him over something that's happened, right? Number two, there are Thanksgiving Psalms. And again, these are like self-explanatory. Like a lament psalm, the Thanksgiving Psalms have two categories as well, individual and corporate. So you thank God individually for what God's done for you, and then also corporately for what God has done for us. Again, I say this because these are the very basic building blocks on how you're going to understand something. If you're reading something, it's meant to be taken corporately. Maybe the way you apply that into your life is to take it corporately. Like that would be an immediate one-to-one kind of application of that. So take it and then apply it to your church community. Take it and apply it to your family. Take it and apply it to your friend group. Don't necessarily take it and just apply it to yourself, even though I think some of those things obviously are going to cross over. Number, that's supposed to be C. Number 3, hymns of praise. This is what we're used to most of the time in regards to what we call worship music. Ultimately, most of our worship music in our churches, especially within a Protestant context, is praise. Okay, this type of psalm focuses the attention on God, and the focus goes to like who God is. So the person singing is not really at the center. So where the lament would be, why is this happening to me? They tend to be at the center, and God, where are you? And so on and so forth. Praise is God is at the center of it, and your attention goes towards God. Again, we're probably very used to this. Salvation history Psalms. Parts of Psalms will have references to like salvation history. So these Psalms focus on how God has rescued Israel from various trials, especially Egypt. So there'll be references to like, God, you are faithful. Like they'll lament, or they'll say certain things about their lives currently happening. God, I feel alone. Where are you? So on and so forth. And they'll go into something like, you are my shield and my rock and my defender, because you rescued us out of Egypt. You rescued us through Exodus and stuff like that. And so the reference there becomes kind of, God, here's what you've done. And so therefore, I'm going to trust you in regards to where I am now and today, what's happening in my life. So that's a salvation history psalm. Psalms of celebration and affirmation. This genre has several different kinds of psalms, such as Psalm 50 and 81, which are designed to lead God's people to a renewal of the covenant first given to them at Mount Sinai. Included in these are royal psalms, enthronement psalms, and songs of Zion. These are songs about the city of Jerusalem. So some of these, like for example, the royal psalms would have been used during coronation services. Okay. Or the enthronement psalms. So again, in your reading, when you come to it, know what you are reading. If you're reading something where the attention is the king and God's, anointing of the king as the ruler over Jerusalem, over Israel, that gives you a proper understanding as to, like, if you take that and run with it and you think God's like anointing you to a certain task or something like that, I would say that's probably a misapplication. Okay, because you are not king over Israel. God has not called you to that task, and so be very careful. Wisdom psalms. These are psalms to teach the reader wisdom. So Proverbs 8 is a wisdom psalm. Very interesting, right? So Proverbs 8 is in the book of Proverbs, and it's seen to be a proverb. That's the genre. But it also falls into the genre of a psalm. And so there's a teaching component to this. And we understand this because there are songs, for example, that we will sing that have singing they have teaching components to them, and they're meant to teach, right? There might be doctrinal truths in them, so it's in song format. And again, songs of trust. These are psalms that teach the reader that God can be trusted, especially in times of despair. Usually these are included within the historical kind of redemption story, and you fall back on, here's what God's done, so therefore we can expect the following from God. Now, these are categories. I haven't really told you anything about like how to recognize poetry, and we'll do that. And I think because our culture is so used to poetry, it's not as complicated as some of the genres for us to understand poetry, even though structurally you're gonna have to see certain things. And so I'll show you guys some examples of these. Okay, so just hang in there. So aspects of poetry. Hebrew poetry, by its nature, was addressed to the mind through the heart. So you're going to have both like kind of an intellectual approach to this and also an emotive kind of reaction to this. And it's meant to do that. Like some people go like, oh, I like it because of the emotional aspect. Yeah, but it's also addressing your mind. Or I like it because of this. And I'm not very, fine with the emotive aspect. It's supposed to do that. As a matter of fact, good poetry ought to do that. It should get all of that firing, essentially. The Psalms themselves are musical poems. This means they will evoke feelings, and other types of writing do not. So if you're reading a narrative and it doesn't evoke an emotional response to it, that's okay. Do not confuse, please, do not confuse your emotional response to something as being the Spirit of God, necessarily, even though it could be. But let's just say you're reading Leviticus and you don't have that emotional response. Don't think that God hasn't inspired that or isn't speaking to you, or God's not in that. Where when you're reading the Psalms and you get an emotional response to it because that's what it's meant to do, and then you're like, oh man, like God's really talking to me. He's really in this. That's just reading good literature, and then literature that's also good but has a different purpose to it, right? So the vocabulary of poetry is purposefully metaphorical, which means you're not necessarily going to take everything literally, right? So there's Psalms where the writer is talking about how much God hates the hands that shed innocent blood, for example. Like, obviously that's an exaggeration of sorts, and obviously it's meant to communicate to us of God's dislike of these things. But you have to be careful not to attribute to God the sort of understanding of hate that you have and say, oh, this is what God's doing, because that God doesn't function like that. He's not a sinner. He doesn't view and respond to things like that. But maybe that's just, again, our response, our emotional response to God, and it's written in that form. Be very, very careful when you do some of these things, especially if you're in a position where you're teaching others. Psalms as literature. Psalms are of several types. So here's what you ask yourself when you're reading Psalms or any poetry in the Bible. What type of a psalm am I reading? That question will do probably 80% of the work. Because if you go, what type of psalm am I reading? And your response is, oh, I'm reading a praise psalm, or I'm reading a wisdom psalm, then you know the purpose to it. You are less likely to misinterpret that and misapply that. Each psalm is also characterized by its formal structure. I'll show you what this looks like, but there's different kinds of structures, and the way they kind of parallel one another and repeat for rhyme purposes or just repetition generally with different words, but have the same sort of meaning. You're going to see that. And once you recognize that, you know what's going on. You kind of put the two together and then understand the main thought. Each type of psalm was intended to have a given function in the life of Israel. Again, some of them are for the whole community, everybody to come around and sing together, as we do in our churches and as we should as corporate communities. And some of them were written from an individual's like life experience, and then so we ought to view it like that. And then there's various patterns within the Psalms. Okay, each Psalms has its own integrity as a literary unit. So like go look up 51:16 or 19. You will see these statements about what God takes pleasure in and doesn't take pleasure in. Those are just like theological, like they have as their own units, like just truths contained within them, and ought to be treated as such. So what are the benefits of the Psalms? First and foremost, the Psalms serve as a guide to worship. Like, I mean, in totality, this has been a part of the life of believing people, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, where music is kind of important, very important, into the life of people individually and collectively. So it serves as a guide. Number two, the Psalms demonstrate to us how we can relate honestly to God. This is probably my favorite one as to what I love about the Psalms. The psalmists do not shy away from telling God that they are not happy with certain things, and they are in pain, and they feel lost, and they feel like God's not there. These are all experiences that we're probably going to go through in our lives. And when I read the Psalms, it's so reassuring to me to say, yes, I can go to God and say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because I feel forsaken. I feel alone. I feel as though God is not there. I feel as though God has abandoned me in X, Y, and Z. Like you get that. You see it. And so that's reassuring for you to be like that. Number three, the Psalms demonstrate the importance of reflection and meditation on that which God has done for us. Very often we will see in the Psalms this remembrance of, God, you did this with our forefathers. God, you rescued us from Egypt. God, how you have done this, right? And so therefore they're reflecting and meditating. And because of that, there's kind of an intimate understanding and expectation of God doing similar things in people's lives. Now, let me actually backtrack here, and I want to show you guys something. Specifically, this is a good visual of what the categories, their separations into categories, and I'm going to show you some structural stuff, okay? Let's see. Okay, so that's not what I wanted. Here we go. Okay, so notice the way that this is, and again, we can categorize this however we want. So if we do it in order, let's just do it in order. That's the way you're going to look at the Psalms, okay? So if you want to separate it by genre, this is the way it comes down to. So notice again, lament and praise are the two largest categories of Psalms. You can do it by author. David did not write all of the Psalms, okay? As you could tell, David wrote a majority of the Psalms, but not all of it. Here's what this is what I like in regards to structure. And I'm going to show you one specific structure to this. And I'll pick one of these and then show you kind of what it looks like. Say we go to Psalm 1. This is the way you're going to recognize poetry in the Bible. These repetitive, parallel statements, the rhyming. We don't know. If you don't know the original languages, you might not see the Psalms rhyming, but the English translations kind of try to bring that to the surface by using similar words and all that. So, for example, look at this. Blessed is the man who walks not, or who does not walk, so that's a negative, in the counsel of the wicked. So this man is blessed, but also notice this language. He doesn't walk in the counsel of the wicked. So the key there being wicked people, ungodly people, nor stand. So now you have someone walking and standing. Those are parallels in the ways of sinners, and you get sinners and the wicked being one unit. And then the individual also sits. So this person does not walk, stand, or sit, which is essentially, it's all the stuff that you get to do. And then the wicked gets wicked, sinners, scoffers. All these are one category. Now, the way that you see the structure of this explained is it gets categorized as this is an A unit and these are B units. And so this is one idea. Wicked, sinners, scoffers, same category of people. The blessed man who does not walk, stand, or sit is one category. So it goes on to say, but, the opposite. So he doesn't do this, but rather he does this, right? So the but, it goes into that who walks not. His delight is in the law of the Lord. Now that's a negative. So instead of doing all this stuff, but the delight being in the Lord, right, is the opposite of that. So it's a contrast to it. And you get a new unit here, right? So we're going to show you kind of what this looks like as a bigger unit here. Okay. And then, and on his law, on the law of God, he meditates day and night. So his delight is in the Lord, and his meditation being day and night is one category. And then you get another. So if you notice these bigger units, so say this big A, which says the righteous man stands not with the wicked, and then this last one, the wicked man stands not with the righteous. That's the contrast, but they're one unit. And then the B unit, there's a B unit here, right? And then you get these C units. So you get a B unit here as well. So blessed man chooses God's law. God chooses the righteous man. You get the parallels there. And then you get this C unit in the middle of it. So if you pay attention, it's sort of like an inverted V. It's like an arrow pointing to the middle of the text. Usually when this happens, the middle of the text is an extremely important portion of the text. So we know that it's talking about a man who is blessed, who doesn't walk, stand, or sit with sinners and scoffers and wicked people. Rather, he pays attention to the word of God. He meditates on it day and night. So the most important part of this text being in the middle, this person, is like a tree planted by streams of water. So he's going to be successful, right? He yields its fruit in its season. Its leaf does not wither. Again, that's the same idea. So the same idea of the fruit in its season and the leaf does not wither, same thing. It's just repetition. Poetry, beautifully speaking about these things. And then you get this unit that stands very interestingly, apart from everything that has been said all so far, that everything that he does, he prospers. And then it works itself back out. So far, everything that's been said is about a righteous person. And you get the middle where he's going to be good in life. And then it says the wicked are not so. So it's going to work back itself out, but the focus is going to be the wicked person. The wicked are not like so. Okay, they're rather than being transplanted by streams of water and bearing fruit, they're like chaff. They're weightless. They get tossed to the winds and they're done, right? And because of that, they will not stand in God's judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked, again, that's the parallel you get here, will perish, which is all that he does, he prospers. The complete opposite of the righteous. The righteous, everything he does, he prospers, but the wicked, he does not prosper, and he will perish. Now, that's out of the book of Psalms, and that's a form of parallelism and the structure that we've looked at. Once you do this a lot and you're able to make those recognitions, right? You're able to say, yeah, you got to try this, right? Like you got to get a pen and a paper and sit there like the way this is and say, okay, can I break this down? Can I see that the blessed is the man who doesn't walk in the counsel of the wicked? And like, how do I break that down? Okay. So I'll break it down by blessed is the man who walks not, and the counsel of the wicked is another unit. And then stands, obviously, is with walk, and then you break it down. And so what you're going to see is the parallelism. That's the first thing you're going to see. Once you do your parallels, again, this book's going to teach you how to do that well. Once you see the parallels, then you're probably going to notice there's a structure to the whole thing. And it's going to be so beneficial to you in regards to understanding what the actual poetry in the Bible is meant to say and do. Now, here's a homework assignment I have for you guys, and you can do it. And we'll look at the text, but I'm not going to break the text down for you. I'll just make a couple of comments on it. But it's also not from a book that you might be expecting it to be from. I just want to show that there is a book where the focus is not poetry. And this is out of Jonah. So Jonah is a prophetic book. That's the intention to the book of Jonah. But in the book of Jonah, we have this segment where, actually move. We have this segment in the book of Jonah where there's poetry. And this is when Jonah is in the belly of the fish. And it says, then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, so here's his prayer. The text tells us this is a prayer. And so we're going to see what kind of a prayer this is. Is it a prayer of thanksgiving? Is it a prayer of lament? Is it a prayer asking for help? Like, what is it? So he says, Jonah says, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. So what does that sound like? Oh man, that sounds like thanksgiving. Like, I prayed and God answered me. So out of the belly of Sheol I cried. And so now we're getting poetic language, because he's literally, say, in the belly of the fish, but the way he refers to the belly of the fish is the belly of Sheol, which is the grave. Right? He says, I cried. You heard my voice. So notice here, I'll just to help you out here. I called to the Lord, and then there's I cried. Right? And then those go along with he answered me. Like, so I cried, I called out, and God answered me. I cried, and he heard my voice. So the way I would do this is say, I called out to the Lord, would be A. Out of my distress would be B. He answered me would be C. Out of the belly of the Sheol I cried would be A. You heard my voice would be C. The distress is left as B. For you cast me into the deep. Now that just means the waters, because Jonah was literally thrown into the waters, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. So notice his experience now of retelling of his distress has nothing to do with being in the belly of the fish. Rather, it has to be with being in the sea, being in the ocean. And the flood surrounded me, all your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Notice Jonah's talking about like he's dying, and he's not in the belly of the fish. He is in the waters drowning. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, again, death there, I remembered the Lord. That's a repentant sort of thing. And my prayers came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, there it is. That's a big clue in the text that this is a thanksgiving psalm. will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Again, thanksgiving because he's been saved. He's literally been saved. His life has been saved. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out of the land. So that's the narrative aspect. So the two narrative aspects here are Jonah prayed, and then the fish vomited him out. And then in between, you get this prayer. Here's the crazy thing about this text specifically. Now, again, to go do your homework, separate it the way like I just told you to separate it. Jonah is happy to be in the belly of the fish. And the reason why he's happy to be in the belly of the fish is because the belly of the fish is the vessel of salvation for him because he was drowning. And in that drowning, he calls out to the Lord and he says, he recommits himself to God and to God's purposes. And God saves him via the fish. And so Jonah sings a song unto God, a psalm of thanksgiving. It's wonderful because quite often we don't think about it this way. And that's why I specifically picked Jonah, because we don't process the information the way kind of understanding Jonah being in the belly of the fish as a happy state to be in. Like we usually think about Jonah being in the fish as like a negative thing, but to Jonah it's a positive thing. And then God, it's God's vehicle of salvation for him. So that's an example of poetry. We've gone through two, and you got to look at the structure. You got to look at how to categorize them properly, how to understand the parallelism that happens. And some of them get really complicated. My recommendation is you would find a shorter psalm and try to practice on that shorter psalm. And then once you've gotten down, then you can kind of graduate and get into more complex understandings. But expect, as you would in any music, any poem, expect exaggerations. Expect metaphors and similes. Like understand your literary tools in all literature. Like expect symbolic language. Expect people to say things that they don't necessarily literally mean, because it's poetry. So if you say, my love is like, my love's hair, like the Song of Solomon says, right? Like my love's hair is like a herd of goats sitting on the mountainside. You don't literally mean what's going on. Like you're painting a picture with your words about her having curly hair. Like we get it if you can visualize it properly. Too often, again, in the church, we are not taught how to read these things properly. We're just told to read, and that's problematic. We ought to be taught how to read. And again, this is the reason why I'm doing this specifically. So hopefully this has been encouraging to you. If you have any further questions or you want resources on how to understand poetry specifically, or just generally speaking, different genres of the Bible, go ahead and leave those comments in the comment section, and I will get back to you. As always, you can reach out to me at info@apologiacenter.com. We do have a Patreon that you can support us for doing things like this. We'd really appreciate it. And look out for next week's video on the genres of the Bible and how to understand those things. God bless.